Thank you.
Okay. So welcome back, everyone. It is now time to begin our third plenary session of New Directions 2020, to be delivered by Professor Linda Taylor. Linda is visiting professor at the Centre for Research in English Language Learning and Assessment at the University of Bedfordshire. She holds a PhD and MPhil in language testing from the University of Cambridge, and she has worked for many years in the field of language testing and assessment, particularly with IELTS and a full range of Cambridge English qualifications. Her research interests include speaking and writing assessment, test takers with special needs, language assessment literacy, and the role of qualitative methodologies in language testing and assessment. For several years now, she was Assistant Research Director with Cambridge Assessment English, and she has advised on test development and validation projects around the world, including in mainland China, Taiwan, and Japan. She has given presentations and workshops internationally, published extensively in academic journals, and authored or edited many of the volumes in Studies in Language Testing series, CUPs series rather. Her talk today is entitled Metaphors We Test By, Communicative Concepts That Connect Language Assessment with Contexts of Use. So please join me, everyone, in welcoming Professor Linda Taylor. Over to you, Linda.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris, and good morning to those of you who are in my part of the world. Good afternoon if it's a bit later, and good evening if you're in East Asia. I realize this is the end of a long day for you, but it's good to be with you, and I'm pleased to be here today to share some thoughts on metaphors we test by. So by way of introduction, exactly 40 years ago this year, an influential volume appeared in the field of applied linguistics, and the title of the book was Metaphors We Live By. And it set out to explore the role of metaphor and imagery in language and mind. In what was later to become a seminal volume in the field, authors George Lakoff and Mark Johnson explained how metaphors of varying types allow us to use what we know about our physical and social experience to help us understand countless other subjects in our everyday lives. This fundamental process of comparison and understanding helps shape our human perceptions and our human actions, and it provides us with a rich language for communicating with others. Within 20 years of publishing their 1980 volume, Lakoff and Johnson's pioneering work inspired numerous research publications in the fields of applied linguistics and language education. And in 2003, they updated their volume by supplying a supplementary section at the end, which surveyed how theory of metaphor had developed within the cognitive sciences to become central to contemporary understanding of how we think and how we express our thoughts in language. And over the past 20 years, advances in corpus linguistics in particular, as well as in other academic disciplines, not just psychology, linguistics and literature, but also politics, healthcare, and the study of print and digital media have shed fresh light for us on the use of metaphor in a wide variety of contexts. So individual academics around the world now specialize in the study of metaphor and other figurative devices in language use, such as metonymy and irony. And cross-institutional initiatives undertake theoretical and empirical research with a wide variety of multidisciplinary studies ranging across psychology and philosophy, linguistics, literature and cultural studies, computational modeling and artistic interpretation. A multidisciplinary quarterly journal called Metaphor and Symbol appeared in 1986, and it's now up to volume 35 in its publication history. And earlier this year, the journal invited contributions for a special issue in 2021 on the subject of metaphors and COVID-19. And the title of the special issue is Framing COVID-19, Assessing the Sociocultural Imagery of the 2020 Corona Pandemic. So it seems that today the study and evaluation of metaphor is fashionable. It's a hot topic. And I shall come back a little later in this talk to explore the role of metaphor in the COVID-19 era that we're currently living through. We shall consider some of the key metaphorical images that catch our attention and engage our emotions. And we shall think about how these communicative concepts connect with contexts of use, sometimes in positive ways and sometimes in less than helpful ways. Like the fields of applied linguistics and metaphor theory in particular, our own field of language testing and assessment has developed considerably over the same 40-year period since 1980. As language testers and assessment specialists, we too espouse and employ various metaphors that help us in our thinking and our understanding about assessment. And the metaphors we test by is the subject of this presentation. And I have an aim to explore some of the metaphors that we have used and continue to use in our own discipline, whether we are consciously aware of them or not. It's by no means an exhaustive analysis, and I'm not a specialist in the field of metaphor theory or even of contemporary applied linguistics for that matter. But I am interested in what we call now assessment literacy and in how useful or helpful metaphors can be in this area, both in terms of how they assist us in our own professional work as language testers and assessment specialists, and also how effective they are in communicating language testing concepts and practices to a wider audience of testing stakeholders. So the outline of my presentation is briefly as follows. I'll start with a brief review of some basic principles concerning metaphors, and then go on to explore some of the metaphors commonly used in language testing and assessment. Then we'll look at some of the current metaphors that are associated with the global pandemic and what they teach us. And I'll conclude with some reflections on the role and value of metaphors in language assessment literacy. So first of all, a review of some basic principles regarding metaphors. Lakoff and Johnson proposed that the essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one thing in terms of another. So metaphorical language allows us to conceive, think, and talk about concepts and our human experience in structured and coherent ways, helping us to make sense of it for ourselves and also to share our understanding with others. In the 1980 volume, Lakoff and Johnson highlighted three particular types of metaphor: structural, ontological, and orientational. Although in their 2003 updated edition, they acknowledged that their original categorization into these three was somewhat artificial. Some examples of these three metaphor types from the opening chapters of their book illustrate how they function. First of all, Lakoff and Johnson suggest that all metaphors are structural in some sense, in that they map the structures of one concept onto the structures of another. So you can talk about argument as war, and it can find linguistic expressions in phrases like, your claims are indefensible, he attacked every weak point in my argument, his criticisms were right on target. The structures of one item map onto another concept. Another example would be time is money. For example, this can find expression in, this gadget will save you hours. How do you spend your time these days? Or he's living on borrowed time. Secondly, all metaphors are ontological, in that they allow us to view events and activities, emotions, ideas, etc., as entities or substances. So we can talk about the mind as a machine through phrases such as, my mind just isn't operating today, or we've been working on this problem all day and we're running out of steam. Alternatively, we can think of the mind as a brittle object when we say things like, he broke under cross-examination, she is easily crushed, or the experience shattered him. And thirdly, many metaphors are orientational. In other words, they draw strongly and consistently on spatial orientation in physical and cultural environments as we experience them. And this is why up tends to be associated with notions of more or better or high or good or strong, while down is more readily associated with notions of less or worse or low or poor or weak. And interestingly, this seems to find a direct correlate in language testing and assessment with regard to the measurement or reporting scales that we typically use and take for granted. Top of the scale, or strong performance, tends to reflect the up orientation, while bottom of the scale, or weak performance, tends to be somewhere down at the bottom. A scale may even be referred to as a ladder, designed to be climbed to the top, not the bottom. And I suspect we would struggle as language testers to see things the other way round and to invert our scales so that they function the other way up would feel somewhat counterintuitive. What about metaphors or other metaphors from the field of language testing and assessment that are a bit more explicit? Well, the presence and the power of metaphors in language testing and assessment is well established. A good example is Spolsky's 1976 analysis of the history of language testing, when he suggested that this could be divided into three distinctive periods of time: the pre-scientific era, the psychometric structuralist era, and the psycholinguistic, sociolinguistic era. Just a few years later, Keith Morrow, English language teacher and testing practitioner, relabeled these three periods as the Garden of Eden, the Vale of Tears, and the Promised Land, with the Promised Land representing the advent of communicative language testing. In employing these metaphors, perhaps Morrow was drawing a powerful literary and cultural analogy, and we might argue that his use of these evocative images brought with them both evaluative and emotional associations, though we might also question how accessible and meaningful they're likely to be beyond a certain audience. And this immediately raises the question of how familiar a metaphor needs to be for it to be meaningful. How accessible or universal does it need to be useful? Will it be understood by groups with differing historical, religious, or socio-cultural traditions in this case? The Garden of Eden, the Vale of Tears, the Promised Land images may be very familiar to those from a Judeo-Christian tradition, or those who've received a Western-style classical education that covered literature and arts. But how accessible is this to a much wider audience? At about the same time in the late 1970s, a rather different metaphor for general educational assessment was employed by French philosopher and social theorist Michel Foucault, when he described testing and examinations used within an educational system as a whole type of power. And building on this, my colleagues from the critical language testing paradigm have written convincingly about language tests as gatekeepers or rites of passage, sometimes used to control boundaries or control entry to social groups or political opportunities. More recently, in 2012, Robert Mislevy at the Educational Testing Service published a very interesting paper entitled "4 Metaphors We Need to Understand Assessment." And I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this paper because I think it helps us to examine and perhaps better understand the power and potential of metaphor in our own field. In his introduction to the paper, Mislevy comments as follows. Everyone agrees that assessment is integral to education, but discussion about how to improve it is prone to contention and people talking past one another. A major problem is that people don't share a language that is rich enough to discuss interpenetrating issues that arise at many levels: personal, social, educative, economic, technological, and statistical, to name a few. He continues, people who may be quite knowledgeable in their own areas of expertise draw mainly on their personal experience as students with familiar kinds of assessments. This intuitive frame suits familiar contexts, but it falls short for discussing assessment policy or for thinking about different kinds and contexts for future assessments. Mislevy's thought-provoking paper, I think, highlights for us various metaphors that are commonly used for assessment, which I shall go on to describe. Each one offers a set of concepts, relationships, processes, and actors for thinking about real-world situations, especially those involving assessment policy, practice, and reform. Constraints of time prevent me from giving a detailed exposition of Mislevy's ideas, but a summary overview here may help give a sense of what's distinctive about each one and what they share in common. So the first metaphor Mislevy identifies is assessment as practice, which takes a decidedly socio-cultural and psychological perspective. Practices are recurring, organized, and socially situated activities to which, as human beings, we become attuned. We use practices to interact with other people and with situations in the world we live in, and over time, we learn the affordances and the constraints of such practices. So the way an assessment is designed and what it requires from students will share some of the capabilities of the real world activities it is meant to prepare them for, but it is not the same thing as those activities. As a socially situated practice, assessments can reflect the setting of expectations, the influence on learning, and the channeling of resources, shaping both the way the test takers view the experience of being assessed and the way test takers are themselves viewed by those administering an assessment. So according to Mislevy, this socially situated perspective shapes the meaning of all the variables and inferences in any assessment system. Mislevy's second metaphor is assessment as feedback loop. This metaphor derives from systems theory, and it refers to the effect where an amount or level produced at one stage within a process or a system determines the next step or steps in that same process or system. And a system could be biological, it could be mechanical, digital, educational, or many other things. The feedback loop may be positive or negative, and it may enable or inhibit the cycle from continuing. The notion of a lever for change is one expression of this assessment as feedback loop. The assessment for feedback loop helps us to see assessment from the perspectives of people in different roles within an assessment system. They may be learners or teachers or admissions officers, but they all need to use information about students' learning. And this raises essential questions about who needs what information, when, for what purpose, and what other information or data sources might be needed in addition. And a key insight from this metaphor is that the value of the assessment data does not depend on the data or the assessment themselves. It depends on who's using it for what purposes as part of a larger enterprise. Mislevy's third metaphor is assessment as evidentiary argument, drawing on concepts from philosophy and logic. Evidentiary argument provides a coherent framework for reasoning logically from the particular thing or things that test takers do or say in a limited set of situations to what they know or can do more broadly. And the concepts and machinery of evidentiary reasoning help us understand assessment in context once again, enabling us to make robust and defensible bridging connections from one point to another. Mislevy comments that this argument metaphor can be clearly discerned in Cronbach and Messick's writing on validity during the 1980s and the 1990s. And in our own field, and particularly in the North American tradition, language testers such as Bachman and Palmer and Carol Chappell have drawn heavily on the imagery and discourse of evidentiary argument. The fourth metaphor suggested by Mislevy centers around assessment as measurement, and this may be the most familiar to us in terms of concept. Rather than literally measuring the physical properties of learners, such as their height or their weight, using mathematical tools and instruments, educational measurement takes a more psychologically driven or oriented approach by providing a framework to reason about patterns of information in context that emerge from the dynamic interactions among students and situations. The measurement metaphor, argues Mislevy, provides instruments and engineering tools to manage data and uncertainty, to support reasoning from complex assessments and extensive data, and to pursue fair and effective use of assessments, no matter what form those assessments take. Mislevy suggests a more accurate characterization of his four metaphors thus far might be to call them semantic frames, using Fillmore's terminology. Though he also acknowledges that this more technical term of semantic framing may be less welcoming. His comment highlights the recurring issue of terminological accessibility and metaphor meaningfulness. And we shall return to frame theory a little later and its potential usefulness in various fields of communication, including language assessment. Taken together, Mislevy suggests these four metaphors complement and balance one another. So assessment as practice complements and also counters assessment as measurement. Assessment as evidentiary argument connects the situated and practical perspectives of the practice and feedback metaphors with the engineering toolkit of the measurement metaphor. In other words, all four metaphors are useful because no single metaphor by itself can convey a full and fair picture. And this may be another principle for us to hold on to. No single metaphor or dominant metaphor can reflect all the angles of a complex phenomenon like language, testing, and assessment. But perhaps more importantly, Mislevy comments as follows. The metaphors have helped me design and use assessment, and they are useful for thinking about assessment policy and assessment futures. In other words, assessment metaphors can offer us a way of thinking and learning about assessment matters for ourselves, and they can also be a method for communicating with others. In addition to the four core metaphors, which he considers as a minimally sufficient set for understanding assessment, Mislevy highlights four additional metaphors, which he argues sit within the four earlier metaphors, but which help to bring a sharper focus, perhaps, to various specific aspects of assessment. Two of these metaphors specialize aspects of his earlier practice, feedback, and evidentiary reasoning metaphors. So tests as contests stresses the competitive nature of assessments in which test takers compete against one another for scarce resources. And we see this in the case of some high stakes tests used for accessing limited opportunities in professional employment or international higher education. Assessment design as engineering emphasizes the particular role of test specifications, curricular analysis, and good item writing practice to ensure quality test construction and maintenance. And the other two metaphors, suggest Mislevy, pull hard in opposite directions on sociocultural aspects of his earlier practice metaphor. So the notion of the test as exercise of power has already been mentioned. And interestingly, Tim McNamara and Carsten Rover even militarized this concept when they wrote of the potential for tests to function as weapons within situations on intergroup competition and conflict. An alternative and perhaps more positive image could be Mislevy's notion of assessment as inquiry, in which assessment is a principled but open way of interacting with students to produce and evaluate evidence about the capabilities they are developing. Mislevy's 2012 paper is a thoughtful and helpful analysis of the presence and function of some commonly used metaphors in assessment generally. And he concludes his paper as follows. Awareness of the key ideas from each and their interconnections provides some common language to begin investigations of particular assessments, of assessments' roles in systems, and in the future of assessment. These metaphors make us aware of conceptual frameworks we can take advantage of, and hook us into the experiences, the tools, and the wisdom of many disciplines. Mislevy does not specifically address language assessment, but his discussion, I think, is relevant to our field because it offers some important insights for the ongoing endeavour of understanding and promoting language assessment literacy. It helps us to reflect on the nature of the common language that we need to achieve this. But one question it raises for me is whether metaphors that we as language testing specialists might find illuminating and helpful amongst ourselves are equally useful to other language testing stakeholders and to the general public. So those metaphors listed by Mislevy may be meaningful for language testers, but are they accessible and meaningful beyond our immediate community, to teachers, to university admissions officers, to government ministers? And if they are not, what alternative metaphors might we need to look for and employ in the pursuit of communicative effectiveness? So what can we learn about good metaphorical use in the time of COVID-19? Well, the global pandemic in 2020 has undoubtedly challenged us to rethink how we do language testing and assessment. At the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has led to an explosion of metaphors and symbols in media communication and in public discourse. Professor Eleanor Semino, a metaphor specialist at Lancaster University, recently commented on Twitter just a few days ago that metaphor researchers have never been busier than since the pandemic started. And the dominant metaphor for our time seems to centre on a war against coronavirus that has to be waged. We need to beat it, and we may be winning or losing. However long the war is, however many battles there are to be fought, there is an ultimate victory to be won. And to do so, we rely on strategy, campaigns, tactics, and an arsenal of weapons: lockdown, testing, track and trace, vaccine. There are heroes to be applauded: the National Health Service, key workers, scientists searching for a vaccine. And there are casualties to be suffered: hospital patients, those who die, care homes, and the economy. Other prevailing COVID-19 metaphors revolve around natural disasters, And Brigitte Nerlich of Nottingham University commented in a recent blog that storms, floods, and fire are primeval ways of thinking about the pandemic. So the disease comes in successive waves. Our hospitals risk being overwhelmed by a surge or a tsunami. We are struggling to reverse or turn the tide, regardless of whether that's actually physically possible in the physical environment. Scientific advisors and government ministers speak of fire breaks to stop or contain the spread, to slow or extinguish the flames in a planned and preemptive way. And the term firebreak technology has even been used to describe immunity for medical personnel and first responders. Elena Semino comments that forest fires are a suitable area of experience for metaphorical exploitation, precisely because they are vivid and image-rich. They are familiar, even when not experienced directly. And they have multiple elements. Trees, that's us. Firefighters, that's the doctors and nurses. Arsonists, they're the super spreaders. And victims, patients in ICU, or the frail and elderly in care homes. And these images have strong evaluative and emotional associations. As part of Research Communication Week 2020 in September, Elena Semino and several of her metaphor colleagues took part in an international webinar entitled Guns, Germs, and COVID-19, Why Science Communication Needs Metaphors. It was hosted by the Foscari University of Venice, which is a public university, with contributions from Gianluca Briguglia, Stephen Flussberg, Marina Chiara Garasino, Dagmar Paulus, Elena Semino, and Roberta Villa. And the seminar's purpose was to explore the nature and usefulness of metaphors, particularly in the context of science communication and the experience of this year's global pandemic. The speakers between them highlighted the benefits and the limitations of metaphors generally. So some of the benefits are that they make something easier to understand. They compare something big and or complicated to something similar and familiar. They help people to learn or understand things, and they help us to talk about things that are important. But there can also be a conceptual or cognitive mismatch between the source and the target. So the source would be the entity or the experience, and the target would be the metaphor. So some of A does not apply to B. And this can be misleading or confusing. Metaphors can engage the emotions, but they may activate negative rather than positive emotions, which can be demotivating rather than motivating. So, for example, a running a race metaphor may be better to stimulate action against climate change or the pandemic spread than a fighting the war metaphor. Constantly framing COVID-19 using war or military metaphors risks being counterproductive. Public fatigue can set in, and anxious authorities may use such language to justify increasingly authoritarian measures. In a similar way, in healthcare contexts, research has shown that framing diseases such as cancer as a war can be problematic if a patient starts to feel that they are not winning the battle. So the insights from this group of metaphor specialists tell us some very useful things. And the webinar speakers advised greater awareness of and collective focus on alternative metaphors for reframing COVID-19. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out as we continue to live through the coronavirus pandemic globally. The specialists also advocated picking the right metaphor for the right audience. They stressed the value of working collectively to find appropriate metaphors using the combined skills of differing groups, such as researchers, or patients, or doctors, or political leaders, in order to come up with multiple ways of talking about complex phenomena in communication to the public and also in other domains. And this sounds like another good principle to bear in mind. Unfortunately, disaster or catastrophe metaphors tend to be both memorable and also newsworthy, and they are the ones that tend to hold sway, negative sway, in public discourse, as we've already seen. Alternative metaphors that are collectively determined, positive, even amusing, may be far more welcome and empowering. And this may be particularly true in times of trial. We just have to work harder to identify and exploit such metaphors. So let's come to a few reflections on the role and value of metaphors in language assessment literacy. Analysing and understanding how metaphor is working in the media and in public discourse during the COVID-19 era may give us some useful insights into the sorts of metaphor we need to help us in our own field, including in the promotion of assessment literacy. Insights gained thus far suggest there might be a case for reframing language assessment using some new and creative metaphors, which will connect more effectively with a wider range of language assessment stakeholders beyond our own community. As I've tried to suggest, the more philosophical and technical metaphors discussed by Mislevy may be accessible and useful within our own profession, but are they too insider focused, too abstract and not concrete enough, too highbrow and not familiar enough, too loaded or biased and not balanced or engaging enough? If our aim is to foster shared knowledge, principles and understanding, not just within our own immediate field, but more widely, mitigating divides and supporting transitions in a rapidly changing world, then I suspect we will need to find communicative concepts and images that will connect and engage much more effectively with contexts of assessment practice and use. A good example of this, though it's now quite old, is Alistair Pollitt's 1991 chapter entitled Giving Students a Sporting Chance, in which Alistair drew creatively on the experience of different sports, comparing high jump with ice skating to help explain the important differences between counting and judging in assessment practice. Alternatively, perhaps metaphors about language learning journeys involving maps, landmarks, milestones, which form assessment points, might be familiar and effective images to draw on for language assessment. The field of science literacy and science communication has already made significant progress in this regard, exploring how to engage multiple audiences using narrative, metaphor, and other communicative techniques. And an excellent example of this sort of creativity for the healthcare context is Lancaster University's metaphor menu for people living with cancer. The menu is a research-based collection of metaphors for talking and thinking about the experience of illness, inspired by a range of people who have experienced cancer for themselves, but have worked with applied linguists to find ways of talking. In their 2019 chapter in the Festschrift book for Tim McNamara, John Pill and Luke Harding suggested the language assessment profession adopt a similar approach, undertaking research to establish a clearer understanding of what works in our engagement with differing stakeholder audiences. They suggested frame theory as a potentially productive avenue for language assessment literacy, since it may offer a way of telling stories about language assessment that stakeholders can interpret and process effectively. And their call echoes a passing comment that I shared over 10 years ago in an article on developing assessment literacy, written in 2009, when I was reflecting on the value of narrative accounts of the history of our field, such as those published by Cyril Weir and colleagues. This is what I said. Narrative accounts contextualize the practice of language testing as a socially constructed and interpreted phenomenon, rather than treating it as primarily a pseudoscientific endeavor that is removed and isolated from human individuals and social values. And it may well be that popular adaptations of this narrative storytelling approach will provide a more effective means of developing assessment literacy among the wider stakeholder community in the future. Perhaps I can close my presentation by illustrating how a simple metaphorical image might be exploited to talk about language assessment in an accessible and meaningful way in a variety of non-specialist contexts. About 20 years ago, I gave a paper at the Language Testing Research Colloquium, LTRC, the annual international gathering of language testers and assessment specialists, and I think it was in Hong Kong. And in that presentation, I recall comparing the experience of taking a language test with the experience of having your photograph taken. Someone else holds the camera while you pose for the photo. You are the subject, and as far as you can, you present your best side to get the best possible outcome. The result is a photograph of you, a snapshot in time. The quality of that photograph is in part down to the skill of the photographer and the sophistication of their equipment. But it also depends on you, the subject. Did you do what was needed? Did you look towards the camera, keep still and avoid blinking? Or did you move your head or close your eyes so that the image of you is out of focus or incomplete? In some cases, a photograph must conform to certain expectations or requirements. A passport photograph, for example, must be only head and shoulders without glasses or hat, and you mustn't smile. A graduation photograph will look rather different. So a photograph may include certain things, but not others, according to context and purpose. But whatever the context or intended purpose, the aim of the photograph and of a language test is to capture a true and faithful image of certain features of the individual concerned. And yet, however good that snapshot is, it remains only a limited representation of the individual concerned. It can only ever be a single snapshot taken at a single point in time. It can only be taken from a certain angle, and it cannot reflect other angles. It is two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional, and sometimes only in black and white, not color. While it will be good enough for certain purposes, it may have to be supplemented with other photographs or images for other purposes. Indeed, a whole album of photographs may be needed. And there may come a time when the photos are out of date and new ones must be taken. You get the point. And you might even say that I chose a photographic frame to tell a story about a language test. Please forgive the play on words. 20 years ago at that same conference, I also remember saying that someone should write a book entitled Metaphors We Test By. Perhaps now is the time, and someone will. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Linda. That was fascinating to listen to. Actually, very kind of therapeutic, actually, after what's been an incredibly long night and now morning, it seems. So sincere thanks for that. Wow.
My pleasure.
So, yeah, it's just incredible to think that we're approaching the end of the first day. It's just been absolutely packed with session after session, and yeah, it's been hard to keep up with everything. It's been incredible. But I think I can speak for a lot of people in saying that it's been an amazing day, and it's not over yet, because we do have a networking event, which the details of which I've posted in the chat box below. And 5 of our plenaries, including Linda, of course, will also be available to have a chat, to answer questions about their plenaries, or just talk generally about their research or any other aspect of language assessment in several rooms, the links to which I've posted in the chat box, and I'll post again in the networking event, which will start at 7. So as for the networking event, yes, that will take place in the room. It's in the community section. It's the networking event room. It'll be a quiz that will take about half an hour. And following that, we'll close the quiz, and everyone can, well, we'll actually keep that room open if people just want to have a general chat among themselves. People who participated in the quiz, they can just continue to operate in that room. But then, of course, you can join the plenaries as well if you wish. So, okay, Linda, thank you very much. And yes.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah, it's been a pleasure. Real pleasure. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I can't believe, like I said, day one is almost over. It's been nearly 12 hours. So let's go and have a slightly lighter kind of session now in the networking event. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
It's a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.